Okay, thank you very much. Okay, discretionary response fund, item 19. Okay, 19, discretionary response fund. So, welcome staff to the table. Is there any commentary on this, or do we move straight to questions?
Interim, which we can provide some information on.
Yep, if you can do that, that would be perfect, and then we'll move to any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, so we had a question from Councillor Galloway regarding the SCAPE application, which Sarah can speak to, Arts Advisor.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So the question was raised around will the change in recommendation from 45k down to 20, what will the impact be on SCAPE's overall position? And it will cause a deficit of $25,000 to that organisation.
So it's written in the decision matrix, but I might just highlight it that the process with SCAPE's operational funding, they have received event funding from the events grant for this financial year, but in terms of that operational funding, last year the strengthening and communities funding, they received $40,000, but this year they weren't in. We did not receive a funding application for them because they were had applied to Christchurch NZ for funding, but were declined for that. And just the way the timing worked, we didn't receive an application. So that's why we're bringing it to the discretionary response fund. Now it's up to councillors obviously to decide what the scale of that is and the implications, but of course the discretionary response fund is a smaller pool, hence the middle ground recommendation from the discretionary response staff panel to grant $20,000 in this financial year.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so that covers the matters that were raised earlier.
Yep.
Okay, so Yanni, do you want to raise that again?
It's just, sorry, we just in line of the question that was asked earlier at the informal, can you just confirm what level of funding RATA and Creative New Zealand have either supplied or been approached to supply?
Yep, so in relation to operational funding, which is what this discussion is in relation to, they have received $40,000 from RATA Foundation. They have not received operational funding from Creative New Zealand because Creative New Zealand funds the project-specific costs. Receiving operational funding is challenging across funders, and the strengthening communities and discretionary response processes are one of the few mechanisms where we can support operational funding. So just to make that distinction of where Creative New Zealand comes in to that tri-funding conversation, is they often fund the artist fees and project specific costs rather than the operational costs of an organisation, and we have traditionally come in with operational costs.
Thank you. Anne.
Thank you. I'm just needing a bit of clarification on that. So are you saying that because SCAPE missed out on the strengthening community funding because they were hoping to get funding from Christchurch NZ, that they missed out on operational funding, and so this fund is not for that, so that's why they're only getting $20,000?
No, because the Christchurch NZ application was declined, it was then forwarded across to council because it had not met that criteria. So we picked that application up to process. By that point in time, the strengthening communities process was already underway and applications had closed. So we had to move this to the DRF process, which does do operational costs, but this is obviously a smaller pool of money. And so that's what the panel had to take into account, is what does that DRF pot of money have the capacity to do at this time of year for the various organisations that are coming in. Does that clarify?
Yep, that's good. And why was it? Why was the $20,000 settled on as rather than perhaps 45?
Because of the limitations on that discretionary response fund bucket, it's considerably smaller than the strengthening communities bucket. And the panel also looked at how that fund usually tracks through the various quarters of the financial year to make sure we have enough to last the full financial year. So their recommendation for 20k was based on leaving provision in that fund to be able to manage applications that would come in for the rest of the financial year.
Can I ask one more question?
Of course, yeah.
Given that I have sympathy for SCAPE in that it's a little bit like a baby being passed between lots of different caregivers and not being cared for as well as perhaps it should be, given the fact that I believe we have an understanding with SCAPE that we will partner with them. And also the indication has been given from Christchurch NZ that they would be treated in a way that would suggest that they are given preferential funding. So it feels quite unfair, I feel, that they've got to this point and it feels like the baby's been dropped. So I'm wondering if you've got any other suggestions about where we could perhaps go for an extra 25,000 that could help them, because at the moment they have been relying on funding, and I'm just wondering if there's any suggestions you might have.
You have the ability to change the recommendation that's on the table through the discretionary response fund. The panel recommendation that has come to the table today has been made in light of what might be anticipated to be needed in the future across the financial year, but you do have that ability to change that recommendation today if you wish. I think.
Oh, sorry, Sarah.
I just wanted to clarify too that the total operational costs for SCAPE are over $300,000.
Yep.
The bulk of which they fundraise or source from patronage,
Yes.
and a small amount from Rata Foundation. So we did discuss and note the impact.
Right. Well, given that SCAPE is one of New Zealand's premier public art events and attracts high visitor numbers, that community participation, it has a free education program for 5,000 local school children at Turanga, and it attracts national and international media coverage. It returns to council's investment exceptional benefits to the city. I would like to amend the recommendation.
So you're going to move
yes,
amended recommendation?
Yep. Just that it becomes 45,000.
Okay. So you're changing one from 20,000 to
Yes.
45,000?
Yes.
And you're moving that?
Yes.
Is there a seconder for that? Just a question. The funds are there. The risk is that we're spending funds early in the financial year, which may mean that applications later in the financial year need to be scaled down or declined because we've spent the funds early in the year.
Yes, that's exactly right. And also the fact that SCAPE have, Council has given SCAPE a reasonable amount of money this year, if you think about the applications that have come around this table. But yes, in terms of protecting the fund, for want of a better word, through to the 30th of June, the end of the financial year, yes, that's part of what we're thinking.
All right. So given that there's no seconder for this, and this echoes some processes we went through recently in terms of a different fund, is there a level at which somebody would be prepared to second this, but at a figure that's lower than 45,000 but higher than 20,000, which meets Anne's intent, but at the same time, so you'd go 25. So Tim, you would second at 30. All right. Well, let's go with that in that case then. So Anne, are you happy to move this at 30,000?
I am.
And Tim, you're happy to second a motion of 30,000. We've clearly understood the implications of what we're doing as a result of the answer to the question that's just been asked. So on that basis, this has now been moved and seconded. Were there further questions?
If that fails, I'll foreshadow 20. Just
Okay.
so that if it fails, we're not left with nothing.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly
That's
sensible.
That's a good
Yeah.
idea.
All right, and I'm sure there will be a seconder for that at the time. Now let's move into debate. Oh, Yanni, sorry.
So, just given that Christchurch NZ is what's caused us this problem, could we go back to Christchurch NZ and say, we actually would like you to fund this?
So I'm not sure that's how we can make things work. What we have done, it's up to Christchurch NZ how they choose to respond to applications. What we have done for the next financial year is change the timeline. So we're partnered together to bring Christchurch NZ's application timeframe earlier. So there's time for us to then process the failed applications into ours for consideration.
But we just heard from our colleague, Councillor Galloway, around the fantastic tourism and the visitation, the positive benefits for the city from a marketing and promotional point of view. So I'm just really struggling with why Christchurch NZ isn't supporting
this sounds like a question to put to Christchurch NZ rather than to our own staff.
Well, should we? Well, all I'm wanting to know is, should we actually have an additional resolution that seeks Christchurch NZ support for it?
We've already had response from Christchurch NZ that it did not meet their criteria.
So they're adamant they will not fund this in any shape or form?
Yes, and that is why it came across to Council.
So in terms of this application, that's where we've got to. If there was a wider conversation we wanted to have with Christchurch NZ about their support and their strategic approach, that would be a conversation for a future time with Christchurch NZ. All right, thank you. So now let's move into debate on this item. Is there any debate? I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? No. Who are the noes? Can I have a show of hands, please? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's carried. That's carried.